Chapter Spooks.
G'day, and welcome to Chapter Spooks, where we talk about the books that keep your kids up at night. And today, we have a pretty good book in this series to look at. And the reason I say that, I think, is that the last book, because it was so boring and bad, at least in my opinion, well, I was so glad to read a book like this, which actually has some meaning. This book has a theme. And yeah, I admit, I am a theme guy. I like writing books that have themes, but also as a reader, I like reading a book that means something. Yes, even something as simple as this, where the theme just seems to be hygiene. That may not seem like much, but at least it's something. At least it's got something that drives the story forward, something to take away when you're done reading it, you know? But before we get into the book itself, we should talk about our ghostwriter, because we have a new one here. This is Daniel Ehrenhaft. Now, apparently he has a couple of pseudonyms out there. Sometimes he goes by Daniel Parker, which I believe is his middle name, and he's even gone by Ehrenhaft, because of his surname. So he's got a couple of different books out there, and from what I could tell, he mostly seems to write drama-type stories. In fact, he seems to have a penchant for post-apocalypse. He has a 12-book novel series, I believe it's called The Afterlife, where there's 12 books of each of the months of the year, because it's 1 year in 1999 after apparently some sort of apocalypse, like demonic apocalypse happens that kills all of the adults that are 20 years and older. Interesting idea, playing around with some different tropes. But the one that caught my eyes was a book called The Last Dog on Earth, which is about a disease that spreads around in the world that causes dogs to become aggressive and violent and then finally attack their owners. However, the main character has a dog that is immune to this, and so he and she traveling around trying to avoid the people that are trying to just get rid of all these dogs because they're becoming violent and dangerous. And of course, it's one of those boy and his dog stories, which is a Bildungsroman, which is another way of saying it's a story that's about coming into adulthood. So it's a very common trope, something I've always liked the idea of in theory, because basically a person having to take care of their dog or pet, it's essentially like Fatherhood 101. It's learning how to take care of someone who is dependent upon you. And you can learn more about yourself whilst learning more about them. It's an interesting idea. And I do say fatherhood because culture does seem to have this tendency to assume that girls don't need to learn motherhood because they just innately have a caring maternal aspect, which is not true, and in fact it's a little bit of a problematic idea. But we're not going to get into that right now because we're not actually talking about that aspect of gender theory. We're talking about this guy's bibliography. So I'm impressed that he's done books like this, because like I said, I like them in theory. I don't know if I could ever write one myself, because in practice the idea of someone slowly learning to just grow up I think would be a little bit tedious for me to write, but that's just because of my own interests. But yeah, I think this guy's a pretty good writer. Daniel seems to know what he's doing, but he's definitely not perfect. I've seen he's got a couple of issues, the very first one being from the title itself. But in order to explain that, I think we need to get straight into this story. So let's just get into the summary of Bone Chillers number 13, The Thing Under the Bed. First things first, we are introduced to Otis Farnsworth, and he is an absolute slob. Even though he's really skinny, he has a thing for food. He eats an awful lot, to the point where his mother is worried that he's overeating. And in fact, he likes to take food into bed as sort of a snack before going to sleep. But when he's finished eating, he doesn't want to get out of bed. After all, he has an insanely comfortable bed. Apparently, he has a water bed. It's called the Ocean of Motion. It's a king-sized 4-poster bed that his parents won in a raffle 2 years ago, and ever since he's had it, he's found it so comfortable that after eating in his bed, he doesn't want to get out just to go to the trash can. He just drops the food off the edge of the bed and he kicks it under in the morning. As a result, this does mean that his room does apparently have a little bit of a funk to it. Even Otis admits that he can smell it a little bit, even though his parents seem to think that his room is disgusting. But you know what they say, a fox can't smell his own den, so it doesn't really seem to bother him very much. But on this night, because he'd been eating before bed, he seems to have a bit of an upset stomach. He just can't get to sleep. But on this night, as he's tossing and turning in bed, he hears something underneath the bed. It's a scritching sound. Scritch, scritch is described as, like scratching under the bed. At first he thinks maybe it's just his cat Muffin. Maybe it got under his bed and it's scratching at the floorboards. Although he doesn't have any idea how his cat could get in under the bed, considering there's so much garbage under there after 2 years of throwing food underneath. But that's when he hears his name being called. Otis. Otis. something under the bed is calling for him. He thinks maybe he's imagining it, maybe his upset stomach is giving him bad dreams or something. And it does turn out that this is true. It's just a dream, because after it calls his name, it screams at him, he jumps upright, bolts upright in bed, covered in sweat, and sees that his mother's in the doorway calling his name, saying that he slept through his alarm again, probably because he was having nightmares. Now, this would be a great introduction to our character. The fact that he's a slob, the fact that he's obviously got something strange on his bed, all this stuff. But there's one glaring issue here. Now, originally I would want to call it a plot hole, but the more I've looked into it, whilst a plot hole can count for things that are inconsistent with the natural world, I think it'd be better to simply call this plot inaccuracy. See, this story is called The Thing Under the Bed, which is a great idea. That's a common fear with kids, having some sort of a monster under their bed. So people even think it's the bogeyman under their bed. They can get them at night, they can nibble on your toes if you step out during the dark hours. But the problem with that in this book is that a waterbed, because it has water in it, water is a non-compressible material. So it can be quite dense. And with a king-sized bed, it requires over 900 liters of water, which means that it can weigh up to a metric ton. And that's before we get into the fact that they often need electronics as well, because water, being a great conductor of heat, means that it loses heat quite easily, so you need a heater to keep the water at a good body temperature throughout the night. But the important thing here is, because waterbeds are so heavy, they don't have an under the bed. The bottom of the bed is usually a box that is full of cross beams and structures just to hold the weight of all of that water so that it doesn't collapse. So in a story where the entire focus is about the idea of having a monster under the bed, the writer gave our main character a bed that physically cannot have an under the bed. It doesn't ruin the story by any stretch of the imagination, but it did annoy the hell out of me. Anyway, rant over. The important thing is that his mum's standing in the doorway yelling at him to wake up, but when she's standing in his doorway, she gets a whiff of his room, and she says that it absolutely stinks. And we get her inciting incident. She tells him, "You need to clean this room today." He has school, but she says, "As soon as you get home from school, you are cleaning this room top to bottom. I don't care how long it takes." In the next scene, Otis is at school, and he's with his friend Tony, whilst Otis is just eating a candy bar. And whilst Tony is sort of asking if he can get a little bit of it because he's hungry too, Otis says that because he skipped breakfast, because he was late, he's not going to give him anything. He wants to eat it all himself. There's a little bit when he's got just the last mouthful left. He looks like he's going to give it to his friend, but he's just tricking him. He just stuffs the whole thing in his mouth, taunting his friend the whole time. But the important thing is, he then takes the candy wrapper and he stuffs it in his book bag. And we learn that he treats his book bag the same way he does the underside of his bed. He just crams rubbish in there. Apparently it smells horrendous. He can't even put his books in there anymore. He carries his books in his arms and just uses his book bag like a portable rubbish bin. His friend is disgusted at this, and when he and our main character get a smell of this is when he realizes, you know what, it's true, I'm an absolutely disgusting slob. I really need to clean out this book bag, I need to clean up my room, I need to fix this. Then the bell rings and the kids head to class, and it's a maths class, and even though apparently Otis is a fan of maths, he can't concentrate because he's still starving hungry. He can't concentrate on the board. And that's when he remembers he's got another candy in his back pocket, apparently a peppermint patty. He takes it out and starts eating it in class, but the teacher quickly catches him, and because there's a no eating in class rule, she demands that he throws it away. He gets up to put it in the bin in front of class, but the teacher says that she's not putting food in a bin designed for cardboard and paper. He's going to put it in his bag, because even the teachers know that he uses his bag like a portable rubbish tip. Both Otis and Tony get horrified looks on their face, but the teacher is insistent. She's incredibly strict, so he tries to quickly unzip it, stuff it in as far as he can, but as he does, he hears this disgusting squelch, like a boot going into mud. All the kids cry out, "Ew!" The whole room is filled with the rotten stench of it, and as he pulls his hand out, it's covered in gross slime and worms. After a chapter break, he's literally out back with the janitor, who is hosing off his bag, trying to get all of the muck out and all of the worms. And after they're done hosing it out, Otis decides to just throw the book bag in the dumpster as well, because, as the janitor had said, you can't be too careful when it comes to worms. When he finally heads home, he's not really sure what he's going to tell his parents. He probably needs to tell them something, after all. They're going to wonder what happened to his book bag. But he seems to think that it's going to go down a lot easier if he says it after he's done cleaning his room. So when he gets home, he heads toward his room to clean it up, and for some reason, maybe because he's just had some really disgusting worms crawling all over him, when he gets to his room, the smell is enough that he can't even go inside. So he heads to the cupboard to try to find some sort of an air freshener, but the can's nearly empty. So he calls down to his mum and asks for more air freshener for his room, and so she says, "Oh, well, that's fine, I'll go to the store, just watch your baby sister Rita for me." Baby Rita is not important to the plot, but I still find her adorable, with her excitedly going, "Gah!" and calling the cat Muffin, "Moof!" And even when our kid hurts himself and goes, "Ouch," she mimics him by saying, "Ouch." Look, it's pretty cute. But I also like how when our kid first picks her up and she's drooling, he says, "Hey, at least I'm not the only slob in the family," which seems like some pretty heavy cope considering the fact that she's a baby, they're allowed to be gross. But Otis could hear that same scratching, scritch sound he was hearing last night. So he puts the television on in front of his sister, puts her in her little playpen, and he heads up to see what's making that noise. And as he gets closer, he can smell it. It smells like a garbage truck mixed with the gross artificial pine scent of the air freshener, because he emptied out the last bit of the can into the room, but all it did was make it smell even weirder. But when he opens the door, he sees that his room is clean. His floor was clean. Well, not clean exactly, but the garbage was gone. The microwave container, the football cards, even the hamburger. All that remained on the little narrow strip of floor were tiny bits of furry greenish-white mold. The same type of mold he'd seen on the hamburger this morning. It seemed strange. Where had the mold come from? Had it fallen off the hamburger after the mice had eaten it? Before Otis could answer his own questions, he heard another noise. It was a noise unlike any he'd ever heard before. It was a sort of low, rumbling, gobbling sound, or a munching, growling sound, or a little bit of both. Grum, shum, grum. Otis was beginning to feel dizzy. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. If a mouse had made that noise, it would have to have been one big mouse. Grum. That was no mouse. And if it wasn't a mouse, there was no point in standing in his room any longer. Otis turned and bolted out the door. Chapter 6. "Whoa, man, chill out!" somebody yelled as Otis flew down the stairs. Otis nearly barreled into the person before he saw who it was. "Tony?" he cried breathlessly. "What are you doing here?" "I just came by to see how much trouble you got into today," Tony said slowly. He hooked his thumbs under the straps of his book bag and peered at Otis with a puzzled, concerned expression. "The door was open, so I let myself in. Hey, are you all right, man?" Otis shook his head. His gaze flickered up the stairs, then back to Tony. "Something bad is going on here," he whispered in a trembling voice. "I mean, really bad." A second glimpse of the monster. We're making it more real. This is good. This is fun. It's a really great way to introduce this next step, build up that tension. Although, okay, minor plot hole, but when the mother left, she definitely closed the door. In fact, that chapter started by saying, after the mum closed the door, I went down to check on my sister, and yet this one opens with Tony saying that the door was left open. Heck, even if you didn't notice that glaring plot hole, what mother would leave her 1-year-old daughter unsupervised and leave the front door open? In fact, yeah, like the other plot hole that I mentioned, this definitely doesn't ruin the story. In fact, my headcanon is that he came in through the back door. But Otis is freaking out, so he wants his friend Tony to help him. So he says, "Look, you just got to have a look at my room. There's some sort of a thing up there, some sort of a thing under my bed." And of course, Tony's first response is, "What, you think there's some sort of a boogeyman up there?" And because Otis doesn't have a response, just sort of a shrug, Tony just starts making fun of him, saying, "This is ridiculous." Otis just keeps insisting, and because Tony can see how insistent Otis is, he decides, okay, I'm going to go have a look. So he heads up the stairs, he opens the door, and he suddenly cries out, "No!" Otis races up the stairs after him to help his friend, but Tony is just rolling on the floor laughing because he pranked Otis pretty good. He saw how serious he was and decided to play a trick on him. And on the one hand, that's a little bit mean, but you know what? In the earlier chapter, Otis tricked his friend by saying he was going to give him chocolate and then stuffed it in his own face. So I like that this is sort of their dynamic. It seems like this is how their friendship works. They make a bit of fun of each other, but they still get along. And you know what? I like it. I think it's pretty realistic. But yeah, there's nothing in there for Tony to see. The only thing that's weird is that it still smells pretty bad, but the floor's completely clean. Tony even takes off his book bag and jumps and lies down on the big waterbed, saying how comfortable it is. Otis is just trying to get his friend to help him out, be like, some sort of a monster ate all this stuff, but Tony just can't believe him. He's literally trying to tell him that there was a bogeyman under his bed that ate all the rubbish. So he just says, no, I want to go downstairs and watch some TV or something. I'm not listening to this. You're taking the joke too far, man. And this is when Otis's mum comes back from the store, and she gives the cans of air freshener to Otis and says to Tony that while she's glad he came over to see his friend, Otis has a job to do. So she basically wants Tony to go home. So he decides to go get his book bag before going home, so Otis and Tony head to his room just in time to see one of the straps from Tony's bag get slurped up like spaghetti and disappear into the darkness under the bed. And they both hear the monster underneath it let out a great big belch. And whilst a belch is usually sort of a comedy sound often used to elicit laughter, I like that Daniel Ehrenhaft has tried to make it a bit scary, because beforehand he prefaces it by saying, that was when they heard the noise. The noise was unmistakable, because it was a noise made by every creature that slithered or slimed or crawled or walked upon the earth. It was the sound of a burp. Like, it's still a bit funny, but I get that he's trying to make it a bit creepy. I appreciate the effort put in there. Tony now, scared out of his wits, goes running out of the house, babbling some excuse that never actually gets to anything, like, I'm sorry, I just gotta go, I'm late, I just remembered, and then just disappears out the door. Otis then tries to explain to his mum that something is going wrong, but she's too busy being absolutely astounded by how clean his floor is now. So she's not even listening, and when he tries to talk about ideas of there being boogeymen in the room, he can't even get the words out because he can hear how ridiculous it sounds to say, there's a thing under my bed that ate the garbage. So his mum gives him the cans of air freshener and leaves him to clean his room. But of course, he's not going in there again. He's worried that this monster is under there. So he hid away in his sister's room for all the afternoon. In the next chapter, the family is eating dinner, and I really like how, even though he spent all afternoon in his sister's room, his mum mentions that he spent all afternoon cleaning, and they could even hear him crawling under the bed, as he must have been getting every bit of garbage under there. Even though Otis knows that that sound was definitely the monster. Because of this whole ordeal, Otis has lost his appetite, and he's acting a bit weird. His parents notice, especially when he sees the cat going up the stairs, and because he remembers he left his door open, he's worried that Muffin will get eaten by the monster. So he quickly excuses himself, and before his parents can say anything, he tries to run up the stairs, and he leaps for the cat, and he grabs it by the tail, causing it to scratch him and yowl and run away. So when his dad follows him, he just sees his son splayed out on the stairs and asks him, "What on earth are you doing?" Otis fumbles together some lie about how he thought he was going to throw up and then he tripped on the cat. So his dad says he should go to his room to lie down. But going near that bed is the last thing that Otis is going to do. So he sneaks into his parents' room to use their phone. And he calls up Tony, because Tony's the only one who's seen evidence of this monster too, so he's the only one that's going to believe him. Unfortunately, when Tony answers the phone, he says that he doesn't want to get involved at all. After all, that thing ate a book bag, it ate all that garbage. What's to say it won't eat a kid? The only advice that Tony can offer is two bits of advice. The first one is tell his parents, which Otis dismisses pretty quickly because he knows they won't believe him. And the second thing is to find out where that bed came from. After all, the parents won it in a raffle, right? Which means that it wasn't brand new, it was secondhand. Who owned it before them? At this point, his parents can hear him on the telephone, so they call up asking what he's doing, and he truthfully tells them he's on the telephone, so he hangs up, says goodbye to Tony, and then goes down to talk to his parents. They want to know why he's acting so strange, and so he sort of tells them a half-truth. He says that there's something wrong with his bed, and so he manages to ask, do they have any information about the person who owned it before him? And they explain that the bed belonged to a biologist who left them a note warning them about something, but they insist it's nothing to worry about. Otis, of course, thinks this is the smoking gun, this will explain everything, so he insists on getting the note, but his dad's very dismissive. He just says, look, if it'll calm you down, I'll get you the note, but then you're going to bed. So he gets the note out of the drawer somewhere, and the note is basically saying that there's a doctor called Dr. Harold Ezekiel Bolderon, and he donated this bed, but he just mentions that just before he donated it, he happened to spill over a terrarium full of worms. He did his best to clean up after them, but just to make sure that you deal with them, because after all, you can't be too careful when it comes to worms. And a quick note, I really do like this, because whilst it's a little bit outlandish, the whole biologist thing, I was a bit worried when the parents said, oh, he left a note that had some sort of a warning, but we didn't think it was anything to worry about. Because, what kind of a character just ignores a warning like that? But then it turns out the warning is just, oh, I spilled some worms. There might be worms. I sprayed it, but you just got to be careful because you can't be too careful when it comes to worms. And, I mean, yeah, that's pretty believable. That seems inconsequential to me. I'm on the parents' side. I wouldn't bother telling the kid either. Sure, it leads to the whole plot happening, but the parents aren't the protagonists. They don't know they're in a horror story. So, now that he's read the note, despite his protestations, Otis has to do what his parents say. He heads up to bed. Obviously, he doesn't want to go to sleep in this thing, so scared that the thing will bite him, apparently he leaps onto the bed just to get on top of it, and then he decides to sleep on the top covers. That way, if something happens, he won't have to scramble with the blankets and get trapped in them. He's just going to be able to jump straight off the bed and run out. Nothing much happens on this night, but I like how they add the detail that he can hear the thing snoring under the bed that night, which is, it makes it so that he has a while before he can finally get to sleep. The next morning he wakes up and sees that he's tucked into the blankets, and he's worried. He doesn't know what's going on, but his mum explains that she came in, saw him sleeping on top, and so she tucked him in, being a good mum. And when he tries to tell her that he could hear the thing snoring, that there's definitely a monster under the bed, she just looks at him like he's an idiot and says, so the cat was sleeping and purring under your bed? But when she leaves the room, he looks at his desk and sees that the school books that he rested there yesterday are gone. The monster ate his school books. But also that means that the monster ate his homework. So when he goes to school that day, he and his friend Tony both have to try to explain that they don't have their schoolwork, their homework, their school books, or any of this stuff. And since the only excuse either of them can come up with is, I left them at his house, they're both sent to the principal's office. And I like that the friends are arguing on the way out because, Otis is saying, why on earth did you say that? Tony says, it's true, I left my books at your house because the monster ate them. Why did you say that? I do like the relationship here. They're obviously friends, but they definitely have a bit of a clash going on. It's got some slight antagonism. Especially when Otis decides, you know what, we're not going to the principal's office. We're going to go to my house and we're going to sort this out now, because otherwise things are just going to get worse. Obviously, Tony's like, well, you're crazy, you've lost, we're not doing that. Otis insists, so he grabs his friend by the arm and he drags him out the door and closes it. But when it closes behind them, Tony's like, wait, no, that door only opens from the inside. So even if he wanted to, he can't do it now. So he and Otis start heading for his house. And this next bit, I actually laughed because I thought the timing was perfect. As they're walking through the schoolyard, Otis turns to Tony and says, now, we got to be quick because we don't want to be seen by anyone. And he's literally interrupted by the janitor yelling, saying, oi, what are you boys doing out of class? So they have to run through the yard and they hear him calling after them like, oh, I'll get you, I always do. But yeah, they do manage to get to Otis's house. Now, Tony does worry that his mum will be home, but Otis explains, no, today's Wednesday, and on Wednesday, my mum goes to visit her sister. She takes little baby Rita to go visit her sister. So the boys decide the best first step is to see if they can get in touch with that biologist who owned the bed first. Balderon, Otis said into the kitchen phone. Balderon, he spelled. I'm sorry, sir, we have no listing for a Dr. Harold Balderon, the nasal voice at the other end replied. Are you certain that's the right spelling? Otis's heart sank. Yeah, I'm sure. Is that all I can help you with today, sir? The operator asked. Yeah, Otis sighed. Thanks. The line clicked and went dead. Otis dropped the phone back on the hook. No luck? Tony asked, rubbing his hands together and peering around Otis's kitchen anxiously. Oh, well, too bad. Maybe we should go back to school then. I really don't feel right being here. No, Otis said crossly. We're here, and Balderon or no Balderon, we're going to deal with this thing now. But Tony started to speak, then stopped himself. He slouched into a chair at the kitchen table. Fine. How? Otis began pacing back and forth. Well, let's see, he said, tapping a finger against his chin. We know it likes garbage. Maybe we can lure it out somehow. We can make a trail, like they did in Hansel and Gretel. Tony sneered. Hansel and Gretel? Yeah, except instead of breadcrumbs, we'll use apple cores and an old cheese and chewed gum, stuff like that. Gee, that's a great idea, Otis, Tony said sarcastically. So when your mum comes home, she won't just find us sitting here with a giant worm or some other kind of disgusting monster. She'll also find a trail of rotten food on the floor. Well, what do you suggest? Otis demanded. Tony didn't answer right away. The expression on his face began to change. First he looked as if he'd forgotten something, and then he looked nervous. "What is it?" Otis asked. Tony looked at him. "Do you know where Muffin is?" "Muffin?" Otis swallowed. Come to think of it, he hadn't seen Muffin when they came in. In fact, they hadn't seen Muffin this morning before he'd left for school either. Otis locked gazes with Tony. "I don't know," he said shakily. "Maybe we ought to take a look around." "Yeah." An instant later, they were up and searching the house. First, they covered the main floor, the kitchen, the front hall, the living room, the playroom. The door to the basement was closed, so she couldn't have gone down there. "Muffin!" Otis called as they ran up the stairs. "Psst, psst! Come here, girl!" But there was no sign of Muffin in the upstairs bathroom, or his parents' room, or even Rita's room for that matter. That left only one possibility. The two of them stood in the hall, staring at Otis's closed bedroom door. A sickening queasiness swept across Otis's body. Had his mum accidentally closed the door with Muffin in the room last night? Or had he himself shut Muffin in that morning without realizing it? "Oh no," Tony moaned. "You're not thinking what I'm thinking, are you?" "I don't know," Otis mumbled. He ran a moist hand through his hair. "Oh man." "Well, there's no point in worrying about that now," Tony said, hurrying back downstairs. "Let's get that garbage." Oh, yes, ramp up that tension. I love it. So, okay, the kids now, they've got themselves a mission. So they get the garbage bags out of the bins and they start creating a trail that goes from Otis's room to the bathroom because they know they can lock the bathroom door. So they start basically tipping out all of the stuff. And I like how just small little details, because it mentions in the earlier chapter, I didn't mention it, but they ate beef stroganoff for dinner last night. And so when describing the garbage coming out of the bin, some of the first bits are described as being napkins smeared with beef stroganoff, things like that. Yeah, just simple little details that I enjoyed. But they create the trail that goes from his bedroom to the bathroom, and then they're about to open the door, set this trap, let the thing come out of the bedroom, when the phone rings. Like, both the boys start panicking, like, okay, what do we do? Should we answer the phone? And they both quickly decide, look, we can't answer the phone because then if anyone answers it, they'll know that we're at home and skipping school. But they both want to know what the phone is about, so they sneak into the kitchen and hear that it's the principal calling on the answering machine. Principal Riddleberger is calling to tell Mrs. Farnsworth, Otis's mum, that Otis skipped school with his friend, and so they need to have a talk with her. After he's done leaving the message, Otis considers for a minute deleting the message, but realizes that that just won't work, because obviously, if the principal never hears from his mum, he'll just call back. But their concerns about school and getting in trouble are thrown aside, but all those concerns are cast aside when they hear the sound of a doorknob turning. The doorknob to Otis's bedroom. Otis and Tony tiptoed into the front hall. They could hear other sounds now, very clearly. Something soft and fleshy thudding against the floor, followed by a rough, harsh, slithering sound. And then a groan. Groan. The two of them leapt back. Otis looked at Tony. He saw Tony's throat move up and down several times very fast. The fear was plain on his face. "Tony," Otis breathed, "if that thing can open doors, then shutting it in the bathroom isn't going to do us any good," Tony finished. There were eating sounds now, chomping and tearing, gobbling and belching. Tony put his hand over his ears. "I can't take it, man," he murmured. His voice was strained. "I think I'm gonna..." And with that, he bent over and threw up all over Otis's stairs. "Tony?" Otis leaned over and grabbed him. He kept his eyes pinned to the top of the stairwell, but he couldn't see anything other than the ceiling and the walls of the hall. "I think we'd better get out of here, man." Tony stood up straight. His eyes were slightly glazed and lidded. "I feel much better now," he said, wiping his mouth. "Jump, shum," came the sound from the upstairs hall. Otis backed up a step. "Tony?" "It must be following the trail," Tony whispered. "Maybe we can shut the bathroom door and put something in front of it. We can keep it in there." At the word bathroom, Otis suddenly remembered he had left the faucet running. He slapped his palm against his head. "Shoot," he hissed. "I plugged the drain. The sink is probably flooding." Tony gave him a strange look. "I'd say that you have bigger problems than that right now, wouldn't you?" Otis looked back up the stairwell. He could hear it clearly eating its way across the floor, slowly creeping toward the bathroom. "It's working," he whispered excitedly. But then the sounds abruptly stopped. Otis turned to Tony. Before he could even open his mouth, an ear-splitting screech filled the air, setting Otis's teeth on edge and sending a chill shooting up his spine. It was the loudest, most tortured howl he had ever heard in his entire life. The ceiling rattled and shook as the thing thrashed about on the floor, frantically moving up the hall toward the stairwell. And that's when they saw it. Or rather, that's when they saw its head at the top of the stairs. The head was enormous. It was as big as the garbage bag they had just emptied, if not bigger. 2 huge green eyes were set in the middle of a wrinkled, scaly, slimy, perfectly round face. There was no nose. The only other feature was a wide, thin mouth, a mouth that was open and dripping with filth, a mouth that was easily wide enough to swallow a cat or a book bag in one mouthful, and probably a skinny boy in several large bites. Otis couldn't move. His body had locked, as if turned to stone. He could only gape at the giant worm that was now inching its way over the top of the steps. "Otis!" Tony shrieked. The sound of his name snapped him out of his petrified state. "The basement!" he gasped, darting out of the hall and into the kitchen. With trembling hands, he threw open the basement door, let Tony down the narrow wooden steps first, then pulled the door shut behind him. First things first, I want to say, I think that this worm is a pretty cool idea because, a giant worm isn't usually scary. If you want to see that for yourself, just read Goosebumps Go Eat Worms. It's really not that scary having worms, even giant worms, but I like the addition of this thing having the wide mouth and the huge eyes because it brings to mind 2 things, from childhood television shows. One of them is the bookworm from Plasmo. That was an Australian claymation show, so if you've never heard of it, something you may recognize is some of the modern-day horror interpretations of Thomas the Tank Engine that imply that Thomas isn't just that grey faceplate, that he's actually some sort of a worm or centipede living inside of the train. And so when you see that worm thing come out, that's the sort of thing I'm imagining, the big eyes and the mouth in this strangely round face stretching out. So yeah, worms, not generally scary, but the idea of that perfectly round face with huge green-coloured eyes and a thin mouth wide enough to swallow a cat whole, I think that's a fantastically creepy idea. Not everyone will be creeped out by it, but I think the ones who are will appreciate that this monster isn't just another generic man-shaped monster. It's the kind of imagination I like to see in Chapter Spooks books. But now Otis and Tony are stuck in the basement, and they're considering what they can do. They're both trying to figure out why their plan didn't work, why it didn't go to the bathroom, and the obvious solution is that because the tap was running, obviously the bathroom upstairs was flooding, and so it was the water that spilled out. So, water again, I guess, but, we'll talk about that at the end. Let's just focus on, so now these kids are in the basement, and they realize that one way that they could wet the creature, because the laundry is in the basement, is they could turn on the washing machine. They've got one of those front-loader washing machines, and they say that if they switch it on, the tub will fill with water, and if they could lure the creature down here, they could get it in front of the machine, they'll open the door, and they'll splash it with water. But I do like the author hangs a lampshade on this because Tony then says to Otis, "That's impossible. Isn't every living thing on the planet like 70% water?" But I like that Otis's response to this is to say, "Well, what are you, some kind of a scientist? Besides, that is not like any other living thing on the planet, and you heard it screaming when it got wet." So Tony has to concede, okay, yeah, so clearly water will kill this thing. But the discussion ends when they hear a bang at the top of the basement stairs. The thing has gotten to the basement door, and it's coming for them. So the kids are out of time. They need to set this plan into action now. Unfortunately, there's no garbage downstairs, but they find a cupboard there that is full of stored cans and jars and things. Obviously some kind of a backup just in case an emergency happens. But Tony just starts grabbing the jars and throwing them on the floor, smashing them. It takes a while for Otis to realize that he's creating garbage, food with glass shards throughout it. So he's throwing them against the stairs, creating a mess and muck there. And Otis grabs cans and starts throwing them against the ground until they start to split, and then he spills the soup and other things against the floor. But it's making a horrible mess, so as they can hear the door at the top of the basement stairs start to splinter from this worm thing smashing its head against it, Tony manages to find a broom, so he starts sweeping the muck, and instead of being several splotches, he's turning it into a line that leads right from the stairs straight to the washing machine. And he's about to finish scraping up the last bit of beans away from the side of the room towards the line in the middle, when there's a huge smash as the door is cracked through and the worm starts heading towards them. Both Otis and Tony run and hide in the corner of the laundry where they're just a little gap behind the furnace they managed to sneak themselves into. And they're stuck there listening, hearing this thing as it leaned down and started crunching the stuff one step at a time, slurping it up off the stairs and eating it. And I love that there's 2 little details here. First of all, the sound of the thing chewing and crunching glass just makes Otis think that there's almost no way they could possibly stop this thing. If it can eat glass without any pain, without any trouble, What's to stop it from just swallowing them both whole? And secondly, his eyes are focused on that last bit of beans that they dropped on the floor, because it's basically halfway between them and the line. He's worried that if they're not careful, the worm might instead go towards the beans and then see them and start coming after the kids, which is why it was coming down into the basement in the first place. I also love the details. As this thing gets down the stairs, Otis can't help himself. He peeks from their little corner at the worm, and he sees how enormous this thing is. It's almost 4 meters long, and although it's a worm, it's not perfectly cylindrical. It's shaped like a tapering carrot, and all along its body it has these ping-pong-sized warts that are sprouting with this whitish green fur that looks just like mold, that occasionally will drop off the creature and slowly dissolve as it rests on the stairs. And just to add to the tension a little bit more, just as the worm gets to the bottom of the stairs, it rises up, like a snake, and it looks at the ground. It looks at the beans that is right in front of the kids, and it looks at the line that's heading towards the washing machine, which is slowly sloshing and filling with water, and it looks at the beans and it looks at the line. And maybe it's because it can hear the sloshing water, maybe it's because it can smell the kids, but the worm decides to head towards the spilled beans. It's heading closer to the kids, and once it's done eating that, the only thing left in front of it would be to eat them. Thinking fast, Tony suddenly jumps up and runs out from the little gap, but he doesn't run out of the basement. Instead, he jumps on top of the dryer and starts yelling and screaming, dancing, slamming his feet on top of the metal to call the worm's attention. It obviously looks towards him and starts heading over, and Otis doesn't understand what's going on. He says, "What on earth are you doing?" And Tony yells out, "Look, I'm distracting it. You open the washing machine." Otis hesitates for a moment, but finally decides that this is the best option, so he jumps out from behind the furnace as well. But once he leaves that little corner, he is face to face with this worm. It's watching him and Tony as it's rearing up its head. Its mouth is open, dripping with garbage, filth falling out. And Otis can't take his eyes off the thing. It's horrifying. He doesn't know what's going to happen. Is it going to strike? And so he's reaching behind himself, blindly grabbing for the handle, and it takes way too long for him to find the handle doing this, and so the creature's getting closer and closer until finally his fingers find purchase. He grabs the handle and he wrenches the thing open, and it spills water all over himself and the creature. As the last of the water comes spilling out of the washer, the worm is drowning in the puddle that's left on the floor. It's splashing and thrashing, yelling out in pain. "Yo!" it cried out, but the sound was helpless, almost pitiful. "It won't be long now," Tony whispered. Otis nodded again. For a moment he almost felt sorry for the worm. After all, the worm was only hungry, and hunger was something that Otis could definitely understand. In a way, hunger was what got Otis into this whole mess to begin with. The worm turned and gave the two of them one last look. It kept looking at them as its green eyes slowly slipped beneath the rippling water. It was gone. A moment later, the water from the washer slowed to a trickle and stopped. Otis and Tony both let out a long, deep sigh. And then something curious began to happen. The worm's body began to disintegrate underwater. Otis could see it coming apart, its shreds of flesh drifting up to the surface in olive-colored splotches and melting away. Meanwhile, objects started to appear. First, Otis saw his math book floating up near the worm's head. Then he saw Tony's waterlogged book bag. Then the microwave container and the candy wrappers and the football cards. "I don't believe it," Tony murmured. In a matter of minutes, the worm had disappeared. All that remained was a stagnant pool of smelly green water. It was completely filled with the sum total of all the garbage Otis had thrown under his bed for the past 2 years. A lump formed in Otis's throat. There was no sign of Muffin. Neither he nor Tony spoke for a long while. "You know what?" Tony finally said. "This is going to be a real pain in the butt to clean up." Otis opened his mouth, but he heard the front door slam before he could get any words out. "What on earth?" he heard his mother mumble. "Otis!" They go upstairs to see Otis's mum and realize that she wasn't actually at her sister's. She'd taken Muffin to the vet because apparently every time it went towards his room, it was acting strange, hissing and screeching, and so his mum thought there was something wrong with the cat. So that's where Muffin was. Thankfully, Muffin was never eaten. But more importantly, Otis's mum wants to know what on earth the two boys are doing here. So they have to scramble together some idea that they were skipping school and they were playing around at home. They were trying to clean up his room and they'd stashed all the rubbish in the basement, but it turned out that they tried to use water and they just made a big worse mess in the attempt. It's a weird cobbled together excuse, but it's more believable than a giant garbage eating worm monster. So Tony ends up heading back to school and Mrs. Farnsworth tells Otis that he is not going to leave this house until the entire house is completely spotless. So Otis cleans up the whole mess, and it takes him the rest of the day. It was about sort of midday when they left school, so it takes him until dinner time that evening to finally finish, and exhausted, he eats some dinner, and then he's joining his parents in the living room, where on the television there's a news report. It turns out that the janitor at the school, Baldwin Halloran, is actually Harold Ezekiel Balderon. He's a fugitive from the law because apparently he was doing some nasty things with science, using poisonous materials, causing harm to the environment, and also performing illegal experiments. And the story ends with the front door ringing, and Otis goes there and sees that his backpack is there, and inside of the bag is a note from Harold Ezekiel Baldwin. He explains that he lied in that first note about the bed when they won in the raffle. Air freshener and bug spray doesn't kill the worms, it sends them into a feeding frenzy. Says one day the world will recognize his genius for creating garbage-eating worms that will save the world's pollution crisis. But he ends the note by saying, "Oh, and whatever you do, please don't give them water, because it hurts them very badly." The end. So, that was The Thing Under the Bed. I really enjoyed this book. It was a lot of fun. But I want to talk about some of the things I brought up during it, especially those plot holes or plot inaccuracies. So, first things first. Yes, technically, the thing with the waterbed means that the book is impossible the way that it's written. There is no under the bed for a waterbed. But after a bit of self-reflection, I've realized that whilst that does ruin the story in that sense, I also think it's unfair to say something like that to the main author, because the reason I know so much about waterbeds is because my parents owned a waterbed. I know a fair bit about them. But my parents owned a waterbed because we were sort of upper middle class family, we had a fair bit of wealth, and so they could afford to own and maintain a waterbed. But the average struggling writer in the 90s may not have been able to afford that, let alone been able to go to a bed store that sold them in their sort of community. Basically, I decided to check my privilege here, because you have to realize that whilst we have a lot more freedom when it comes to research, Wikipedia didn't exist in the 90s. And Google image search wasn't invented until 2001, so even though I had a quick search to see whether there were any waterbeds with space under them, and that was quickly dismissed, you can find some that look like they've got 4 legs, but if you look in different images you'll realize that that's just a facade. They still do have the huge box underneath carrying the weight. But not everyone had access to it, so rather than pick on Daniel Ehrenhaft for not being able to afford a luxury item, I think it'd be a lot better to just say, you know what, I didn't enjoy that part of it, but I accept that he may not have had access to that info. Next, Otis is an interesting character in the sense that he is such a slob. Like, I was almost wondering if this was going too far, because the idea of literally carrying around your backpack just to be a garbage tip and putting literal food under your bed and not being able to smell the rot, like, I was wondering if it was going too far. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I think that's kind of the point. That, yeah, maybe some kids will do some of these things. Kids will cram rubbish in places, kids will not deal with their food properly, they will not clean up right. And I think the whole point is that Otis is meant to represent the worst of the worst. It's meant to say, this is the kind of person you are if you do this. So it's almost like he's deliberately being a... what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a bad example. Like, he's deliberately the worst of the worst to try to say that if you're like doing any of these things, you're like this kid. And very quickly in the book, he starts realizing that he is absolutely disgusting doing these things. So I think that's on purpose, to try to get kids to realize just how gross this stuff can be. Like, yeah, when I was a kid, I never did anything that extreme, but one time I did have a milk bottle that I forgot about, that I put the lid on and left under my bed, and I was wondering why my room started to smell, and then I realized that it's because the milk had gone rancid, and even though it had the lid on, I could still smell it. Like, yeah, kids can do gross things, they can be forgetful, and they can throw stuff under their bed, so I like this. It's extreme, but it sort of gets that idea through, that even if you're a little bit like this, it's a problem. I was also going back and forth on the fact that Otis is said to be very skinny. He's literally described as rail thin. On the one hand, I appreciate that this book isn't making him a fat character so that they can do the whole fat equals disgusting sort of thing. Like, I appreciate that, but on the same token, he's also the main character, And so maybe it's the fact that in the 90s you can't have a fat main character because fat people can't be heroes, like that whole negative stereotype. But it also got me thinking because, now this is entirely in my head, this is just something I was considering, because here's the thing, right, so he's rail thin, he's very skinny, even though he seems to overeat to the point that he eats a lot at lunch, he's constantly feeding on snacks at school, he's eating chocolates, he eats just before bed, so he's overeating and yet he still feels hungry. Right? Now, also take into mind the fact that he also sweats a lot. Twice he's described as waking up in bed sweating, and I know that he was having a nightmare, but remember, water beds are temperature regulated because they have a heating system to make sure they're the right temperature for you. So he's sweating despite the fact that he's not very hot, which means he's struggling with heat regulation. When he's fighting the monster also, remember in one of those excerpts it actually said that he had wet hands, so that was because he was sweating when he was just dealing with this monster at home, so he clearly can't regulate his heat there. Also, he has trouble sleeping because, he tends to have an upset stomach, but it also mentions that he seems to have trouble sleeping on more than one occasion. It says this night he couldn't sleep because he was upset stomach. And if you look at all these and think of them as symptoms, sweating, poor heat regulation, weight loss despite eating a lot, a feeling of hunger all the time, and trouble sleeping, there's a possibility that Otis Farnsworth has hyperthyroidism, which is a condition where your thyroid keeps putting out those thyroid hormones, which means that you're constantly feeling hungry and it's processing the food. Sometimes it's caused by an iodine overdose. It might even have something to do with diabetes, which can also make you feel hungry, if not full, but there's no mention of him having symptoms with the bathrooms. I don't think it's what the writer intended, but there is the possibility that maybe Otis has an enlarged thyroid. And of course, I have to mention this. This is the second time that we've had the same solution twice in a row. So for both Slime Time and Toilet Terror, it was drying out the monster. And now in both Night of the Living Clay and in The Thing Under the Bed, it was Soak the Creature. Although I'm willing to accept it here because this is really all about, like I said, hygiene. It's about cleaning. And it makes sense to me that if you're dealing with cleaning, the idea that, you use water to wash stuff away, to clean it. So it makes sense as the way to defeat the monster. Honestly, it should have either been water or maybe even soap. I think it would have been better if it was soap because, the creature was heading towards the bathroom. So rather than flooding the bathroom, because, the creature was getting soaked before it went into it, which means the water was spilling out. So I think that would have taken more than an afternoon to clean up. You need to make sure you dry that stuff. Anyway, but the point is, a lot of people, when they get to the end of the soap, because it's really hard because it keeps vanishing, and you've got these tiny little strips of soap on soap bars left, what if somebody had thrown it out? And so when they leave that trail heading towards the bathroom, maybe the worm eats a little bit of soap, and that's what causes it to gag, and it ends up spitting it out and escaping. So then when they're in the laundry, the way they stop it is with other cleaning materials. I think that'd be more interesting, because the whole thing with them flooding the basement doesn't actually make sense. They imply that when he opens the washer door, during that whole scene, until the creature dies, it's implied that the water keeps coming out, gushing out of the washing machine, even though they don't really have that much water in them. In my experience, they have very little water, unless you've got them on a huge, high-intensity load. They try to save as much water as possible. Oh, maybe that's a modern thing, I don't know, maybe back in the 90s they weren't as worried about wasting water. But the point is, you still wouldn't fill a basement with the amount of water in these things. That's a bit silly. It doesn't really ruin the story, but I honestly think it would have been even better if they avoided that and went with the soap thing, because then to me, instead of having it drown and dissolve, I think it would have been much more fun if instead they'd fed it soap. And because the whole thing with soap is that it breaks down the lipids, the oils of anything, and of course every living creature has cells that have a lipid bubble, generally speaking, that makes up the cell membrane, and so that would totally make the thing deteriorate and disintegrate. But I think it would be much more fun if the thing had exploded in the end. So not only would he have to clean up all the mess, but he'd then have to clean up the worm guts as well. See, I think that'd be a lot of fun, because I thought it was really clever at the end having all the rubbish come back, because obviously you don't want the solution of the story to be, well, that was horrible, but hey, at least I don't have to do XYZ thing anymore, right? But the whole point of this is about hygiene. Hygiene isn't just about a magic solution, having a magic garbage monster come and deal with it, because if it turned out that the garbage-eating worm had actually solved the problem in his room, well, then that's giving the wrong impression. That's not teaching kids that you need to make sure you clean up after yourself. So I like that, although I think, like I said, it'd make more sense to have the worm explode and spread more muck, make the mess even worse, rather than simply soak the place with water and have to drain that out and also clean up the exact same mess. That's not really a complaint, that's just thing I think you could make the story better that way. And also, it annoys me because it's like the other book, but obviously the writer writing this didn't know that. I think they tend to write these things concurrently. If you're working on your own story, you're not worrying about what the last author did. You're getting your story done as well as you can. And I think he did do a pretty good job here. The only thing I want to say at the very end here is I personally don't think that the thing with the biologist and the letter at the end needed to be explained as explicitly as it was. But by the same token, I think it was solving two issues. One of them being that whilst I didn't care where these things came from, because it's all about that theme of hygiene, some kids might have. It might have been really distracting to think, okay, so there's a giant garbage-eating worm monster, what's that all about? And secondly, it was closing off that storyline, because once you introduce the idea that there is this dangerous biologist out there, you kind of have to say, well, is he still out there in the world? Now, personally, I think that's a creepy idea to end your story with saying, yeah, we dealt with this, but the person who caused it ultimately is still out there wreaking havoc. You know, that's a creepy idea that I personally like, but I understand why you might want to round it off with the story. You don't need this to be giving kids nightmares about there being dangerous scientists out there destroying the world, you know. But I should point out that even though the janitor had washed out the bag with water, he emptied out the contents first before washing it out, so there still remains the possibility that there could still be some of those garbage-eating worms in the dumpster, when you think about it. So, given all of that, I really enjoyed this story. I really like this. It's got a great theme about why you need to be clean, about the importance of hygiene, about the dangers, because obviously in the real world, the dangers are you might get sick, but you know, that's not that much of an engaging story. So they introduce this idea of the huge monster, because yeah, you can get vermin, and this is taking it to that extreme, going that original idea of horror. Like I said, it's taking something the kids wouldn't understand and explaining it in terms they could understand. Yes, you can't understand that you'll get sick and might get some sort of horrible infection, but you can understand vermin and monsters that will eat you. So this is why you need to be clean. I really liked that. I enjoyed that. It was a fun story, fun characters, and even though it had some of those little issues that bring it down a smidge, it wasn't enough to make this a bad story. I'm giving this a B-. Like I said, I really enjoyed this story, and I learned a couple of things from it, but one of them wasn't exactly in the story. So there were a couple of times in this story when it had ideas that weren't fully formed, and so I was left sort of considering them. Like in that earlier scene where the mother, quote-unquote, left the door open, at that point, I wasn't sure where this monster came from, and I was wondering, wait, when the kid came in and he said that the door was open, but the mother clearly closed it, is that a sign that the monster got in by coming through the front door? So whilst the kids were in the room and Otis was playing with his little sister Rita, was that when the monster came inside and snuck into his room? Also, before I realized that the worms were monsters and they were actually, you know, an experiment made by the evil biologist Harold Ezekiel Balderon, I was wondering, because in the story they describe them as thin little white worms crawling around in garbage, I was wondering if in reality they were maggots, which is even grosser because you realize that that means that there was actually meat rotting in his bag because maggots eat meat. Now, it turned out that wasn't true, just like it wasn't true that the monster came in through the front door, but these things got me thinking about a concept which is really useful, especially in horror writing, and something that you should consider yourself. In academic circles, it's a concept known as reader-induced affect. And this is because it's not just about horror. Obviously, I'm talking about horror, but it could be reader-induced empathy, reader-induced sadness, reader-induced humor. But in this case, it's reader-induced horror or dread or disgust. So, for instance, in this book, when they're describing the worms, but they are acting like maggots, so that would induce in the reader the realization that there's something worse here. So even though the book didn't say it explicitly, the reader introduced it to themselves. Because obviously, if you just want to gross out the reader, then you could just describe it. You could talk about the absolute slime and rotten muck dripping. Like, this book does that a fair bit when describing the worm monster. Like, if you just want to gross out the reader, there's ways to do that. But a more subtle and more insidious way to do this to your reader is to have them build the disgusting concept in their head themselves. My favorite example of this, and this is one I've done once or twice, when dealing with monsters, you know, sometimes they have slime or muck or blood or even guts, things coming out of these creatures. One trick you can do to your reader is when describing the consistency, you could say it's like glue, you could say it's like water, but my favorite trick is to use food. So you step on a bug and it squishes between your toes, squelching out like peanut butter. And the reason you do this is because you trick the reader then into thinking about that thing being on their tongue. Because, that's where peanut butter goes. So that's a way to induce the reader to be even more grossed out because they're thinking of the consistency of something in their mouth, even though not once have you told them what it tastes like, but you're making them think about it. Or how about one that this book actually does that I think is very clever? Throughout the book, they do put Muffin at risk. However, they also have a 1-year-old baby in the house throughout the whole story. And that's a clever idea because even though not once in the story do they put Rita at risk, I couldn't help but thinking, once Muffin's gone, isn't the next obvious escalation to eat the baby? And like I said, I think she's adorable. I think she's cute. I don't want her to get harmed. The story never says that, but I induced that in myself because I couldn't help but think, okay, well, it's eating books. The next step is cat. Next step before eating the child himself is little baby sister. You see what I mean? Like, this is an example of reader-induced affect. Like I said, that's the scholarly term. I personally call it the DIY creep out because you're making the reader build the horror for themselves. And so it's more visceral to them because you didn't make them do it, their mind did it for them. So consider the way to do this. First of all, you could just put the pieces in place as done in this book by just having the victim there, potentially at risk. You can describe things in ways that make people think of them like I said, food that they put on their tongue. You could have it that when you describe something visually, you could use terms that are themselves scary. Like a common one is describing talons and claws on monsters the same way you describe a scythe, because there's two associations there. Firstly, in farming, a scythe just sweeps right through things, cutting them down, nothing stopping it. And secondly, of course, the Grim Reaper. So you're making a simple blade represent death and destruction simply by describing it like a scythe. If you want to see a fantastic example of this at work, there's actually a creepypasta out there about a homeless man with a strange psychic ability. I'm not going to spoil it for you. In fact, look it up. On the creepypasta fandom, I believe it's simply called Ability. So look up that creepypasta about the homeless man. It is a pitch-perfect example of reader-induced affect. Of course, it's very subtle, so you might have to read it twice, but I guarantee it's one of the few creepypastas that are actually worth a damn. There's many, many more, but the point is, I want you to appreciate and utilize the strength of reader-induced affect. The second thing I want to talk about here is a concept that I think is horrendously abused, and in fact, I think even the person who first said it got it wrong. You might have heard, if you've been in writing circles, there's a bit of advice that says, write what you know. Now, apparently this advice came from Stephen King, but the problem is that most people interpret it the same way he did, which is that because you write what you know, you should use your own experience. But as anyone who's read Stephen King can realize, that means that most of his stories are about a drug-abusing or alcoholic horror writer who lives in Maine. But even though I think that that advice does get misused, I do think that's where the issue came in this book with the whole waterbed issue. Like I said, I don't think it ruins the story, but the point is that obviously the writer didn't know, and they made several assumptions. But the thing is, you don't really need to do that. I don't know why you would, especially because most people own a bed, but also everyone knows what comfort is. Even if you've never owned a waterbed, surely you understand lush and plush pillows. Maybe instead of having it be a waterbed, it could have been an amazingly large California king bed that was incredibly lush, soft pillows. Maybe it has down blankets and so many quilts and all these things. But the point is that write what you know is actually twofold. First of all, it is to say that when you're writing something, you should use your knowledge to its greatest extent. So, for example, I have never swung a sword before. Because of course not, I don't own a sword. I've definitely never had one that's sharp, So, I've never swung one. However, I do know what it's like to swing a long metal thing, because I helped my brother when he made his bed that had a metal frame, but also I know what it sounds like when meat is cut, because I've worked in a kitchen before, in a professional setting, so I've used knives, and I know what it sounds like when a sharp knife cuts through something, and I know what it sounds and feels like when a blunt knife cuts through something, and so I use those experiences if someone's swinging a sword at an unarmored foe. I know what that's like, even though I've never done it, because I'm writing what I do know, which is what it's like to swing heavy things and what it's like to do that. So that's my point. You can use that to build your story. So Obviously, you may not know what it's like to hold a gun, you may not know some of these things, but you can use the knowledge that you have in order to write your story. And the second part of this is in writing what you know. I think I've said it way too many times, so I won't dwell on it too much, but you can do your research. And research may not necessarily be sitting at a computer doing the study. Like, my favorite example of this is I once wrote a story where a character was being attacked by a witch who had magical powers. I didn't know how they defend themselves, so they grabbed a door and they ran with it. And then I was thinking, I don't know what that's like. So I went outside, I grabbed a wooden board, and I was running around my backyard like an idiot with a board in front of me because I wanted to know what that felt like. You can write what you know, and that doesn't mean that if you don't know something, you're screwed. It means go find out. You could do that in this day and age. Like I said, I'm not going to pick on Daniel because they didn't have Google image search and they didn't have Wikipedia back then. But you do. You listening to this right now, there is free access to Wikipedia. Unless something horrible has happened to the world where that stuff has been banned or monetized, you have access to this information. You should have a library. Get a library card. Go do the research you can, because the best way to write what you know is to know more. But hey, if you thought this was scary, just wait to see what I've got in store for you next time.